Thanks, Dr. Hellevang, for being on this Q&A today, and appreciate your earlier presentation on raw commodity storage and handling. We want to continue this topic with a few questions, and to start out, let's start with, is aeration important in the tropics, and how can we do aeration?
Well, temperature control is important as part of grain storage. So typically we would be thinking of the need to aerate the grain to control the temperature. But we also need to be concerned about the humidity of the air that we might be aerating that grain with. And in the tropics, where we're looking at high humidity conditions, aerating the grain might actually be adding moisture back to the grain. Since storage management really is dealing with controlling not only grain temperature, but primarily grain moisture content, in the tropics, we may be better not to ventilate that storage with an aeration system. In some areas, what they will do is run it through some type of a air conditioning system to remove some of the moisture. But typically, we probably are going to be better off just making sure that the grain is dry and then not aerating the grain, or we might be introducing more moisture in that grain.
Great. Do you think water activity measurement is better rather than moisture, as the spoilage due to mold infestation is related to water activity?
Well, in reality, water activity and grain moisture content are very closely related. Water activity is looking at a determination of what the water level is in the grain and comparing that to the environment that might be around that grain. Grain moisture content is somewhat similar to that in that we go by what is called equilibrium moisture content, where we look at both temperature and relative humidity of the air around, and then try to look at a grain moisture content that is low enough so that we don't have mold growth occurring. So if we look at a recommended moisture content of, well, let's say 12% moisture, in an indirect way, we're also looking at water activity. So it's really which we're more comfortable with using. A 12% moisture content recommendation really does take into consideration that water activity that some of the food scientists are maybe a little more familiar with.
Continuing along with moisture, it is difficult to get corn with moisture content of 12 to 13%. How do you manage when moisture is around 14 to 15%?
Well, it's important for a storage standpoint that we really look at a 12% moisture. If we tried to store that 14, 15% moisture at the warm temperatures that's going to be occurring in the tropics, we're going to have spoilage occurring and mold growth occurring fairly rapidly. So if that is the moisture content of the grain that we're able to access, then we need to go through some type of a drying system in order to reduce the moisture content from 14 down to 12 to 13% moisture. If we try to store it at 14 to 15, the only way we would be successful is by controlling the temperature. If we were able to cool that grain and have it at maybe 40, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then we could get by storing that 14, 15% moisture. That really isn't realistic in a tropics environment. So really the only option is to reduce the moisture content of that corn by running it through some type of drying system.
Great, thanks, Dr. Hellevang. And to move on towards our final question, what are some practical recommendations towards storing corn in a bag and placed in a warehouse?
The recommendations for storing grain in a bag would be similar to storing the grain in any location. We need to start out by making sure that that grain is dry. And so even though it might be going into a sealed container as a bag, it still needs to be down at that 12 to 13% moisture. And then we need to do what we can to control the environment around that stored grain in those bags. So being concerned about the both temperature and relative humidity of the air around that bag of corn or grain becomes very important, very critical to success. In some areas, they're looking at actually using bags that are lined with plastic so that we can assure that that humid environment does not move into the bag and into the stored corn. Generally, that's not the practice that's easily available. And so we need to start with dry grain and then try to keep the relative humidity of the air in that storage building or environment low enough that we're not seeing the moisture content of the corn increase.
Thanks for those recommendations. Do you have any closing comments for our audience here today?
I frequently get asked, about storing grain in different parts of the globe, and the recommendations are similar. We need to be dry enough to store that grain in the environment that we're in the tropics where we have warm temperatures and higher humidity, then we really need to think about what we need as far as recommended storage moisture content, and then whatever we can do to maintain the temperature as cool as possible, but still keeping that grain dry.